Nevada Territory, late autumn, 1874. The wind tore through the valley like it carried a message meant for no one but her. Elira Landen pressed her back against the warped wooden wall of the old chapel, her face streaked with dirt, her lungs aching. Somewhere in the distance, hooves pounded the earth. Men shouted. But in here, it was quiet except for her heartbeat, thudding like a drum in her ears. She had ridden until her mare collapsed under her. Then she had run. She did not know what town she was near. All she knew was she had to disappear. And when the ruined steeple appeared through the trees like a crooked finger pointing skyward, she had stumbled inside without thinking. The chapel was abandoned, half its roof caved in, dust dancing in the light through broken stained glass. But it was dry, hidden, and silent. She crouched behind the pulpit, clutching the small derringer in her shaking hands. She had never fired it. She had only carried it because her husband told her it made him feel better. That same husband now lay dead in the dust behind the burned-out stagecoach, alongside the two men who had come to collect what he owed. She had not cried. Not when they hit him. Not when they dragged him from the coach. Not when she ran, barefoot, bleeding, her dress torn to the knees. She had only run. A floorboard creaked. Elira froze. Breath hitched in her throat. She had not heard the door open. Then a voice, low and careful, echoed through the chapel. "You do not have to hide from me. You are safe now." It was a man's voice. Not sharp, not loud. Gentle. Like the way you speak to a spooked horse. Silence. Then again, a little closer. "I saw what happened. I was trailing the coach from the ridge. I am not one of them. I promise you that." She did not move. Her eyes darted toward the broken window. The light was fading fast. "My name is Merritt Rourke," the voice said. "I am not armed. I left my rifle at the door." Still, she said nothing. Then he said something softer. Not meant for her to answer, just meant to fill the space. "You are breathing too fast. If you stay like that, you will faint." "I have water with me." Elira's grip on the derringer loosened a little. Not much, but enough. The man stepped into view slowly, his hands open, his face calm. He looked like he had come straight off the trail, dust on his boots, a streak of dried blood on his sleeve. Dark hair wind-blown and eyes sharp, but not cruel. He looked younger than she had expected. Maybe 28, maybe older. She could not tell. "I saw you run," Merritt said. "Saw him fall. I was too far to stop it, but I followed you." Elira's voice cracked as she finally spoke. "Why?" He crouched down, keeping his distance. "Because no one else did." She stared at him for a long second. Then, slowly, she stepped out from behind the pulpit. Her dress was torn, her hands scraped raw, her dark hair a tangled mess. But her chin lifted, and her eyes met his. "I do not trust you," she said. "You do not have to," he replied. "But I am going to get you somewhere safe anyway." They moved under cover of twilight. Merritt led her through the trees behind the chapel, down into a draw where his horse waited tethered near a dry creek bed. He gave her his coat without asking and helped her onto the mare's back, then walked beside her, leading the reins. Neither of them spoke much. Only when the wind shifted did Merritt glance back and say, "We will ride through the night. I know a place." Elira did not ask where. She simply nodded and held on. By sunrise, they reached a narrow canyon cut through the hills. A small homestead sat tucked between cottonwoods and stone. Merritt helped her down, his hand steady at her waist. He opened the door to the cabin. It smelled of wood smoke and coffee long gone cold. Everything inside looked clean but lived in. A rifle hung on wall hooks. A child's drawing was tacked beside it. Elira's eyes caught on it. "You have a child?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the ride. Merritt hesitated. "I did." She looked at him. "My daughter, Yvette. She was 5. She and her mother died in the fever 3 winters back." Elira said nothing. She only stepped across the threshold and sat down slowly on the bench by the hearth. Merritt busied himself with the fire. "You can rest here, as long as you need." "And then what?" she asked. He turned, holding her gaze. "Then, if you want, I will help you keep running. Or help you stop." She slept for nearly a day. When she woke, the world felt quieter. Merritt was outside, splitting wood. She watched from the window. The way he moved, deliberate, strong, calm, settled something restless in her chest. That night, she sat by the fire as he brewed coffee. Her voice was low. "My husband gambled everything. He lied to me about the debts. When they came for him, I thought they would just take the money. But they wanted more. Merritt said nothing. He only passed her the cup, warm and steady. They would have killed me too. But they did not, Merritt said. Because you ran. She looked at him. I do not know what to do now. You do not have to know that yet. Days passed. Elira helped around the cabin. She mended a curtain, swept the floor, learned where Merritt kept the flour and salt. He never asked her to do anything, but she found herself wanting to. Sometimes, they would sit in the quiet after supper. He would carve, and she would sew, and no words had to pass between them. Other times, he would tell her about Yvette, or about the years he had spent riding with supply trains during the war. She told him about growing up in Illinois, about the piano she had loved and never learned to play, about how her name meant truth in a language her grandmother used to speak. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, she walked out to where he stood by the fence. When you called to me in that chapel, she said, your voice. It made me feel like I had already survived. Merritt looked at her. I do not know how to thank you, she whispered. He stepped closer. Elira, you do not owe me anything. Their eyes met. His hand brushed hers. And for the first time in a long time, she did not flinch. Instead, she leaned into it. Into him. The wind moved through the cottonwoods. Soft. Safe. And Elira knew something had begun quietly, like a whisper in a ruined chapel, but real. The first snow came quiet, thin as dust, settling on the porch rail and the tops of fence posts. Elira stood just outside the cabin door, arms wrapped around herself, watching the flakes drift through the still morning. Merritt stepped out behind her, tightening the straps on his satchel. It won't last. Ground's too warm still. She glanced over. Where are you going? Town, he said. Supplies running low. Her fingers curled tighter into her shawl. How far? About 4 hours ride, he said. I'll be back by night. Elira hesitated. I can come. You could, Merritt said, his voice even. But the sheriff there's kin to the Barkers. One of the men your husband crossed. I don't think you want your face seen. Her throat tightened. You think they're still looking? I think they'll stop looking when winter's deep and the pass is close, he said. But not before. She nodded. Then I'll stay. He adjusted his saddlebag, but didn't move. There's a rifle above the door and a pistol under the floorboard, left side of the hearth. You remember? I do. He studied her a moment, then gave a small nod. I'll be back before dark. Elira watched him mount the mare and ride out, the hoofbeats soft in the fresh snow. When the trees swallowed him, she turned back inside. The cabin felt different with him gone. Not empty, exactly, but paused. She lit the stove, boiled water, and set to work scrubbing the floorboards near the hearth. She had noticed the soot creeping out from the edge of the stone, and it gave her something to do. Her hands moved without thought, steady, while her mind drifted. By midday, the snow turned to sleet, tapping against the windows like fingers. She found herself drawn to the shelves near the desk. There were books there, some worn thin at the edges, and she pulled one down. The pages were filled with pressed flowers, each labeled in a careful hand. She traced the writing of Yvette, age 4, and closed the book gently, returning it to its place. Time passed. She made a stew from dried beans and salt pork, kneaded bread from the last of the flour. As it baked, she stepped outside to bring in firewood, careful to scan the tree line before moving. When she turned back toward the cabin, something caught her eye, a strip of fabric, caught in the brush just beyond the path. She moved toward it slowly, heart beginning to thud. It was hers, a piece torn from her dress during the flight from the coach. Wind must have carried it here, or someone had. She looked back toward the cabin, then toward the ridge. Nothing moved. Merritt had said nightfall. She returned inside, bolting the door behind her. As dusk settled, she lit the lantern and sat near the fire, the pistol resting in her lap. The stew boiled low. The bread cooled. Still, Merritt did not return. Then, just before the last light slipped away, she heard it, the rhythmic thud of hooves. She stepped to the door, pistol ready. The rider emerged from the trees, Merritt, dusted in snow, hat pulled low, leading a pack horse heavy with supplies. Elira exhaled and lowered the pistol. He dismounted stiffly, jaw tight. Sorry I'm late. River swelled from the melt. Had to wait it down. You're here, she said. He nodded once. Anything happen? She opened the door wider. There's stew. You should eat. He stepped inside, peeled off his coat, and hung it near the fire. She watched him from the stove. I found a scrap of my dress near the path. Merritt paused. Recent. Didn't look it, she said. But I wasn't sure. He moved to the window, scanned the trees. I'll set traps tomorrow. Just in case. You think someone came through? I think it's best to be careful. They sat at the table, the fire casting long shadows across the room. After a few spoonfuls, Merritt set his bowl down. There's a woman in town runs a boarding house. Knows how to keep quiet. If you ever wanted to go farther, Carson, maybe, or over the state line, she'd help. Elira kept her gaze on the steam rising from her stew. I don't want to keep running. Not yet. He didn't press her. After supper, she stood by the hearth, her voice low. I'm not scared of being alone. I've done that. But I don't want to be lost anymore. Merritt looked up from where he was coiling rope. You're not. She turned toward him. Then why does it still feel like I might disappear? He stood slowly, crossed the room. Because it takes time. To belong again. Their eyes met. Will it happen here? She asked. That depends, he said. On what? On what you choose to build. She didn't answer, not out loud. But she stayed close as the fire burned low, and when he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. Her fingers fit against his like they'd had practice. Outside, the snow had melted to mud. But inside, the world felt steadier. Not because the danger had passed, but because they weren't facing it alone. The storm rolled in before dawn, not with thunder but with a heavy sky and a silence that pressed against the windows. Elira woke to the sharp scent of damp earth and the creak of the wind nudging the shutters. Merritt was already up, boots thudding softly as he moved about the cabin. She heard the scrape of the door latch and pushed herself from the cot. He was outside, covering the woodpile with oilcloth, his shoulders hunched against the cold. She pulled his spare coat around her and stepped out barefoot, feet sinking into the damp earth. He glanced at her, but didn't speak until the cloth was tied down. Ground's too soft to ride out, he said. We'll stay close today. Elira nodded and followed him inside. The fire was low but still alive. She added a log, watching the flames catch, then turned. You have traps out past the ridge, she said. Won't they drown out there? Merritt poured water into the basin and washed his hands. Some might, but it's too soaked to go check. I'll set new ones once the ground firms up. She dried her hands beside his and looked toward the shelves. You keep things in order. Even out here. He gave a quiet shrug. I learned not to wait for someone else to do it. Elira crossed to the table. Who taught you that? My father, Merritt said, dropping into the chair across from her. He wasn't a kind man, but he was steady. Broke horses for the army up near Fort Churchill. Said a man's worth was in what he left behind upright. She reached for the tin of tea leaves and spooned some into the pot. Did you leave anything behind? Too much, he said. Then added, some of it I meant to. The kettle hissed. She poured the water and sat across from him, her eyes thoughtful. I used to think love meant staying no matter what, she said. Even if it hurt. Even if it made you smaller. Merritt stirred his tea. And now, I'm learning it's something else, she said. It might be quiet. But it doesn't shrink you. He looked at her with a stillness that wasn't heavy. You're not the same woman from the chapel. I'm not sure who I am yet, she said. You don't have to be sure, he said. But you get to choose who you become. Elira looked down at her hands. The scabs at her knuckles had almost healed. The skin along her palms was rougher now, used to work. She folded them together. I want to be someone who keeps her promises, she said. Even to herself. Merritt nodded once, not as approval, but as understanding. They spent the day inside, the earth too wet for walking, the sky too dark for much light. She helped him oil the saddle leather, her fingers learning the rhythm of it. He showed her how to check the stitching, where to look for where. They worked side by side without needing to speak. Later, she found a small tin box tucked behind the ledger books. Inside were bits of colored thread, a needle, a scrap of muslin with a child's careful stitching. Yvette's, Merritt said from behind her. Elira touched the fabric gently. Did she like to sew? She liked watching her mother do it, he said. This was her first try. Elira ran her thumb over the uneven lines. She was proud of it. She returned the box to its place. That evening, as the wind howled low across the roof, Elira stood at the stove stirring a pan of cornmeal mush. Merritt sat nearby, tying a new snare. I've been thinking, she said. He looked up. If we're staying through winter, we'll need more stores. Dried fruit, More flour, salt. Maybe beans, if we can trade for them. His mouth lifted faintly at the edge. We? She met his gaze. Yes, if you'll have me. Merritt set the snare aside. You already know I will. She turned back to the mush, her chest warm despite the draft by the door. After supper, she brought the basin to the table and began peeling the last of the apples. He joined her, fingers deft, the work shared without discussion. When the bowl was full, he reached across the table and brushed a curl from her cheek. Do you miss music? He asked. She smiled, faint and real. I haven't thought of it in a long time. You hum sometimes, he said. When you think I'm not listening. She met his eyes. I didn't mean to. I'm glad you did. Silence stretched between them, comfortable. Then she reached across the table, her hand resting over his. I'm not afraid anymore, she said. He turned his palm up to hold hers. You're safe here, he said. But more than that, you're wanted. She leaned forward, her forehead against his. The wind outside kept on, but inside, the quiet held. There was no need for more words. Not tonight. The days shortened. By late afternoon, the sun was already slipping behind the ridge, casting long, pale shadows across the yard. Elira stood at the edge of the vegetable plot, her skirt damp with cold dew, pulling what she could from the thinning vines, half-soft carrots, a few onions with their green tops curling inward. The rest would be lost to frost before week's end. Merritt was down by the creek, clearing the stone path that wound toward the old smokehouse. She could hear the scrape of his shovel against rock, slow and steady. The snow hadn't come back, but the nights had grown sharp, and the cold hung in the ground like a warning. She carried the basket inside and set it by the hearth. Her fingers ached from the chill, but she didn't mind. Her body had changed in small ways, arms firmer, steps quicker, hands used to weight. The woman who had stumbled into the chapel had worn silk gloves and never held a shovel. This woman stood straighter. Merritt came in as she was peeling the onions, boots clumped with mud, sleeves damp from the spray. He pulled off his coat and hung it by the door without speaking. The quiet between them was easy now. Not empty, but lived in. You're tracking half the creek in, Elira said, brushing her hand against the floor. He glanced down. That path's worse than I thought. Stones keep slipping out. I'll need to dig a new line come spring. Reroute the water east. She nodded. We can use the ash to harden the walk for now. Merritt leaned down and picked up one of the carrots from the basket. You thinking of planting again? In the spring, she said. If we're still here. He looked at her then, his gaze resting on her face like he was studying something important. I want to be, she added. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped to the shelf and pulled down an oilskin bundle, unwrapping it with care. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, yellowed and creased, with property lines inked in faded strokes. This land belonged to my grandfather, he said. He bought it after the war with a script voucher. Said it was too dry for corn, too rocky for cattle, but too quiet to leave. Elira traced the lines with her eyes. You never said. No one ever asked. He folded it back and returned it to its place. If you want to stay, Elira, I'll build a second room. There's enough timber near the ridge. I've got nails stored in the loft. She set the knife down. I don't want another room. His brow furrowed slightly. She crossed the space between them, her hand brushing against his sleeve. I want to stay as we are, but only if it's something you want to. Merritt's voice was quiet, but sure. It is. Later, after the onions were stored and the stew simmered low, Merritt reached into one of the saddle bags he'd brought back from town and drew out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He held it out to her. She opened it slowly. Inside was a length of green calico, soft and thick, the color of moss after rain. I thought you might need something warmer, he said. You've been mending that old dress more than it wants to be mended. She ran her fingers over the fabric. You didn't have to do this. I know. She folded the cloth carefully, pressing it against her chest. I'll sew it into something useful. He smiled faintly. I figured you would. That night, she brought her cot closer to the hearth. Merritt didn't say anything, but he added another log to the fire and sat beside her on the floor, stretching his legs out in front of him. She leaned back against the stool, her shoulder brushing his. The wind outside had settled. Only the faint creak of the chimney and the sigh of the fire remained. She reached for his hand and laced her fingers through his. Tell me something about her, Elira said. He didn't need to ask who she meant. She liked lavender, he said. Used to tie little bundles to dry behind the stove. Said it kept the mice out. Elira nodded. My mother used to do the same. With Rosemary. They sat like that, sharing stories in low voices, the kind too small to carry anywhere beyond the walls. Not confessions, but exchanges. Pieces offered, not requested. When the fire dimmed, Merritt stood and offered her his hand. She took it, and he drew her up without a word. They moved slowly, deliberately. There was no rush in the way they undressed, no hesitation in the way they found each other's warmth. No promises spoken aloud, but something deeper sealed between them. She fell asleep with her head on his chest, the rhythm of his breath steady beneath her ear. By morning, frost had silvered the windows, but inside, the heat between them was enough. By mid-December, the creek froze in the shallows, and the air carried the scent of pine and iron. The cabin walls held tight against the cold, but Elira still woke every morning before the light, building the fire back up with kindling Merritt split the day before. The rhythm of their days had settled into something quiet, and sure chores shared without speaking, evenings spent beneath the same heavy quilt, and small plans whispered in the dark. That morning, Merritt brought down a box from the loft rafters, the wood brittle with age. He set it on the table and brushed off the dust with the side of his hand. I meant to go through this last winter, he said. Didn't have the heart for it then. Elira sat across from him, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Do you want me to leave you to it? He shook his head. No, I want you to see. Inside were papers folded into careful rectangles, 2 yellowed photographs, and a leather-bound ledger with the initials CR, his father's. Merritt flipped through it slowly, pausing now and then, his thumb pressing into the creases like he was grounding himself. Elira said nothing. She only watched. I used to think I needed to carry all of it forward, he said quietly. The land, the way things were done. I didn't know you could change the shape of something and still keep it honest. She reached across the table, her hand resting over his. You can, and you have. He hesitated, then lifted a folded envelope from the bottom of the box. The seal was cracked, but the ink inside hadn't faded. My mother wrote this after he died. I never opened it. Elira didn't speak, waiting. After a long pause, Merritt slid the letter back into the envelope and set it aside. I think I'm ready now, but not today. She nodded, understanding without needing more. That afternoon, while Merritt patched the stable roof, Elira began cutting the green calico he'd given her. She worked by the window, the light pale and slanted, her stitches small and neat. The fabric would become a work dress, something sturdy enough for wood hauling and still soft against the skin. She worked slowly, letting the rhythm of the needle settle her. When he came back in, streaked with pine sap and grit, she held the half-finished bodice up for him to see. It's good, he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Looks like it belongs on you. She lowered the fabric, her voice low. I never had a place where I could grow roots before. I always felt like I was one mistake from being sent away. You're not leaving, he said. Not unless you ask to. Elira stepped closer, her chin lifting. Then I want to make this our home. Not just a hiding place. Something real. He met her gaze, and his voice was steady. Then we'll build it. The following days were filled with motion. They cleared the storeroom and lined it with shelves. Dried apples and smoked venison hung from the beams, and Merritt began marking the ground where the future greenhouse would go. Elira started collecting stones from the creek bed, laying them along the edges of the path to hold the earth firm. On the shortest day of the year, Merritt brought in a cedar bough and laid it across the mantel. My mother used to do that, he said. Said it reminded her that green things still lived, even in the dead of winter. Elira placed a tin lantern beside it, the wick flickering low. Then we'll keep it burning. That night, as the wind curled against the shutters and the fire cast soft light across the floorboards, Merritt reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small cloth pouch. He handed it to her without a word. Inside was a silver ring, plain but solid, worn smooth at the edges. It belonged to my grandfather, he said. He gave it to my father, who never wore it. I want you to have it. Elira turned it over in her palm, the metal warm from his hand. Are you asking me? I already did, he said. Every day since you stayed. She met his eyes, her voice steady. Then I'm saying yes. Every day forward. They stood in the hush between firelight and shadow, and he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit without force. Her hand curled into his like it had always known the way. They didn't speak of ceremonies or papers. What they'd chosen didn't need witnesses. It was built in the way they moved together, in the quiet trust that had taken root and held strong through frost and fear. Spring came slow, but it came. The creek thawed in ribbons, and the soil softened under the sun. Merritt planted potatoes while Elira set the first tomato seeds in a wooden box by the window. She wore the calico dress now faded softer with washing and the silver ring that glinted when she reached for his hand. In town, the Barkers had been run out after a failed claim-jumping scheme. The last of their debt collectors had moved east, chasing easier prey. The sheriff died of a lung sickness in February, and a new one, young, sharp-eyed, and disinterested in old gossip, took his place. Merritt heard it from the blacksmith, who had traded him nails for pelts. "You're free to come down with me now," Merritt said one morning as he saddled the mare. Elira leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed loosely. "I don't feel hidden anymore." He smiled in that quiet, private way that belonged only to her. "Then let's stop acting like you are." That evening, they rode together into town. Elira wore her new shawl and left her hair loose. They bought sugar and flour, and Merritt traded for a new saw. No one looked twice at her, save the schoolteacher, who asked if she'd come to the quilting circle on Wednesdays. They left before nightfall, riding home slow. The sun dipped behind the hills, and the sky turned the color of ripe peaches. Merritt reached for her hand as they crested the ridge, their cabin below lit by the small, steady glow of the hearth. "Looks different from up here," she said. He looked at her, not the cabin. "No, just more yours now." They rode the last stretch in silence, the kind that needed no filling. Inside, the fire was warm, the door closed tight against the wind, and the home they'd made stood quiet and strong around them. They didn't speak of what tomorrow would bring. They didn't need to. They were already living what they'd chosen. Together. Always.